We're a couple minutes late, but I saw a few people trickling in, wanted to give you a chance. Welcome back after the break. Did you have a nice little coffee break? Get a little caffeine pick-me-up? My name's Ashley. I am the track host for today. Welcome back if you've already been here for some of the amazing talks. If not, welcome to Oceana. I'm very excited to welcome Vanessa to our stage. Thank you so much for being here all the way from New York. And I've always wanted to do this because I worked at NBC live from New York. It's Vanessa.
Hopefully you're not as jet lag as me, but I think I never adjust when I come over to Europe. But good afternoon, my name is Vanessa Johnson, and today I want to show a practical way to stop guessing accessibility in tests. And the core idea is that instead of handwriting your Playwright checks after the UI is built, we can declare semantics once in our GraphQL schemas, generate tests from that marked up schema, and then let the browser prove whether those semantics were actually used or kept on your web screen. So we will need to embed our accessibility information or metadata into our API, and we are going to be doing that by using directives. And we are going to be diving into auto-generating Playwright tests from our GraphQL schema. So before we dive in, a little bit about me is that I'm an Android engineer at the New York Times. I've been there about almost 2 years now, and I work on the Games app. So I know many people probably don't know that the New York Times has games or has a cooking app, but if you've heard of like Wordle, Connections, maybe even Pips, which is one of our newer games, that's the team that I work on. And this talk grew from asking, what if GraphQL actually knew accessibility? And this version of the talk will show how we can provide that accessibility information and test the information we get back from the API. So making accessibility a first-class citizen in our API design and have that work across all your platforms, so that could be Android, iOS, and web, and then having the metadata bridging the gap between API design and inclusive user experiences can make the user experience better for everyone. So let's start off with the why accessibility matters. About 16% of the population has some sort of disability, which equates to about 1.3 billion people. So as you can see, that's a large subgroup or target user group that you're not catering to when you have your product if you are not taking the steps to make your features or your products accessible. About 71% of people leave inaccessible sites, depending on your disability. So if you have poor UX or poor labeling when it comes to like when users use screen readers or accessibility tools to announce what's on their screen. So if you are lacking in those labels, then someone that cannot see the screen or has a hard time reading the screen cannot go through and transverse your site or your app. And then really about only 4% of the web is actually fully accessible. So according to the Web AIM Million 2026 report, looking at the top million visited websites, only 4% are fully accessible. So these numbers are like a reminder that inaccessible experiences affect real people, real tasks, and real products. If teams don't hone in on the steps that they can take to make their features or products more accessible, or if their testing strategy does not catch those semantic issues early, they're choosing to allowing your users to see those issues when they arrive to your site. So and also missing out on a potential user group. So some common web content accessibility guideline failures types are low color contrast, missing alternate text for images, missing form input labels, empty links, and empty buttons. So for this presentation, we're going to be honing in on the missing information that needs to be fed to our accessibility tools, and that will be information that's spoken out from your screen readers. So these types are more the common ones, and usually you check accessibility after layouts and functionalities are already done. So you're missing names, have a weaker structure where it's harder to apply the accessibility, and confusing focus behavior depending on how you order, like in the order of the way that someone's going to be transversing your screen. So there are predictable outcomes for workflows where semantics are added late, or when your communication between your teams can be better. Now, those examples show that there's a gap in our APIs, or at least room where we can shift the accessibility talk earlier on in the features workflow. So our APIs shape our UX first, so they define what information is available, how it's organized, and influence UI decisions before designers even start. Many times, accessibility is added late. It's usually the last push to get a feature out, maybe the last milestone. So it's typically addressed during UI implementation and long after API contracts have been finalized. That leads to inconsistent implementation. So many times, a developer on one platform can be just constructing your accessibility metadata or information in a certain way. And then, depending on how strong your communication is from team by team or cross-functionally, then that can be constructed differently on a different platform. So that leads to inconsistency across platforms, and that can go to contribute to drift and a lot of duplicated logic when you are doing or constructing these things on the same way on different platforms. So you can kind of think of it as a way where you have an architect that's designing a building, and when you have a blueprint, you have the walls and everything that's thought of in the beginning. But then for software engineers, when you're putting on that new feature, the infrastructure for accessibility is usually treated as like the coat of paint, something that's like you add on later on in the process to say like, okay, this is the finishing touches, let's get it out there, have people come in and tour the house so it can be sold. So with those gaps comes with pain points, and so there's no single source truth for accessibility. So you have your labels, your roles, and your descriptions that are scattered across client implementations, creating that inconsistency. Client-side stitching is brittle, so text assembled from multiple fields breaks when data changes. So depending on what you are displaying on your UI, if you are either adding to your UI or taking away what you're showing, then you would have to go in and make those adjustments per platform. And then semantics drift, kind of like the same idea, where for web and mobile implementations, they diverge, creating inconsistent user experiences. So this all contributes to when accessibility is added late and you're not, putting it in the focus or the front of your mind to say, hey, we should see what is the experience that we want our users to have when we are displaying this information. So with those in mind, let's look at how constructing the accessibility information on the client side. So this is a Android example. So you can think of that we have a movie list, and I'm a user trying to figure out what movie I want to see or listen to. So we have a row. Each row is specific to a movie, and depending on the movie that I get from my API call, let's say I have a title, a rating, and a release year. So I construct or take those pieces and make some type of string and apply it to my row. So a row is just going to be the horizontal arrangement of your components. And then I'm going to apply it to my content description, which is going to be the information that I'm feeding to my screen readers or accessibility tools. So as you can see, I'm constructing it here, and then you can imagine that's going to be constructed, could be in a similar way, but in a similar way that doesn't necessarily have to be the same way, but on iOS or iOS or web, sorry. And then phrasing can depend on developer, so I can construct it in a certain way, but then someone else on a different platform can orient the words in a different order. So the key thing to keep in mind here is that this pattern can be unmaintainable as your UI changes or as your data changes. Okay, so seeing that, the core claim is that the server should also ship your semantics. So right here we have a type of a movie, and then the same 3 pieces of data that we spoke about in the last slide. And I'm not saying that the server is going to replace your accessibility work in your UI, but I'm saying that the server can provide a contract or like a source to say that this is the information that should be applied to whatever component depending on the role. So if we take this type and then apply accessibility into it, that can be attributed to our area attributes on web, our compose semantics on Android. If you're iOS, it could be the accessibility labels, and then we can incorporate any CI validation to catch any regressions early. So schema as a contract, schema can define semantic requirements, not just your data shape. And then client agnostic, so we would want this to be able to be usable on each platform. And then, like I said, CI enforced, contract validations catches regressions early. Okay, so before I show directives, like I know we talked about that in the beginning, I wanted to find some things I kept in mind before doing this. So they need to be additive to the existing schema to mitigate how many breaking changes you're going to have. Optional for existing clients, so we know this is going to be something you have to roll out incrementally, so you need something to gate it or have some feature flags where you can say, okay, this is the scenario where I want this accessibility object to be retrievable, and then other scenarios where you don't want it to be retrievable. Semantic is not based on styling, so we don't want to take into account like any CSS that someone would, how they construct their site, and just make it more semantic so it's more applicable to different pages on your website, or if you're on your app, then it'll be a little bit different. And then stable over time, so meaning that we want to make sure that we don't have any unstable names and creating unstable tests, which can lead to flaky tests. So I'm going to have a sandbox GitHub link at the end of the session that shows how this can work. But so in the GitHub link, we show that there's 4 directives that we can use. So the accessibility label here is the primary identifier for the screen readers. So that's probably the default name or information that you want to be spoken out. The role, so depending on if it's a group, a button, a link, an image, etc. Then we have a template that describes the descriptive text, so a human readable sentence that can be spoken out. And then the token is supposed to be a way for you to add some flexibility into your attributes. And I'm going to go into more detail on each of these on the next few slides. Okay, to start off, we have the accessibility label. It's the main identifier for the screen readers to announce first, depending on your use case. So in our movie example, it might just be the name of the movie. And then it's applied to the object type or individual fields, depending on the use case, so it points to the field that best represents the object. For a token, this provides more flexibility and more information to an attribute. So the data type or the field type that the token represents, so maybe if you're dealing with money, you can say a price. For our movie example, we can do with a rating or a date. Priority is order of importance. So in the next slide, I'm going to show how we construct the sentence to be applied to a component, but this will show the order of which they should be within that sentence. And then the lower the priority, dictates where they are in the sentence. So the lower the priority, that's the earlier on they are in the sentence. You can also include a prefix or a suffix, so formatting numbers with dollar signs or percentages or ratios depending on what you need them for. And then same thing for Booleans, depending on if you are stating a number as 299, sometimes it can be spoken out as 299, and that's not something you'd want unless that is your intended way that you want it to be announced, but that can be an issue that arises. And then for our template now, we can use the fields in your schema and create a sentence. So constructing a more natural language, readable sentence to be spoken out naturally to your user. And then we talk about the runtime submission, ensure summaries stay current with changing data. So whatever you query for within your query is going to be the information that's within your sentence, and then whatever you don't query for won't be in there. So that will decrease the amount of time depending on how many items or pieces of data that you query for. So now when we combine those 3, this is just a default or basic example where you can have your type and apply the sentence or template onto your type and utilize whatever attributes you want to be in the sentence. And then you can apply the other directives per attribute. So we can have the label and then the token. So the token here is providing more information. Like say for the price, we can say use the prefix and the field type as price. And then you can query for the accessibility object on the bottom, and then on the right it shows how the accessibility object is constructed. So you can see that there is a templates type that includes your summary. Okay, so now looking at a more concrete example, keeping with our movie, we are applying the role and the template to the type, and it's including the 3 pieces of data that we've spoken about. And it has a token and the label, where the token provides information about the where they are in the sentence, and then what label is tied to it. So say for the release year, it will add in released in. And then this is only the first half of the type, or the marked up schema definition, because I couldn't fit everything on one slide. But this is the first half. And then keeping that in mind, we have the second half where the label position tells you where it should fall in the sentence in reference to the attribute that it's on. So the label is the accessible identity, the role is the structural meaning, and the template plus the tokens gives you the descriptive output that is like the human readable sentence. Now, to make this all possible, we have to wire up our schema in a smarter way. So we do start off with our directives. We build our GraphQL schema, and then we utilize a plugin that can be used in your resolver to construct the accessibility object that you can get back in your response. So then with that, when that plugin is ran, you can query back for the object, and that's going to be in your response. So here, on the left, we have our query, where we query for all the information that we want. And on the right is the example response. So it shows the title and the other pieces of data. But then within the accessibility object, we have our summary, where it takes our pieces of data and then using the tokens information in the previous slides, it added in extra information to construct this sentence. So in other words, you can receive structured accessibility information from the same schema that already gives you the generic or basic information, like within your database. So that is important because now accessibility intent is no longer hidden like within your comments or constructed within like your UI files. Here I'm showing that you can query the object and ask for the accessibility metadata. So they're showing it in like a real-time, I guess, GIF. And you can see there's only 3 pieces of data. So just for the example, it's a small data set. And you can see the summary here of each movie. And then here, I'm just showing the flexibility, so just seeing that I'm querying for less data, and those are the only pieces that are within your summary. So we are excluding the release year, so only the title and the rating are in this summary. Okay, so by the time we reach Playwright, GraphQL is no longer the thing that's directly tested. The browser is what we verify because that's what users experience. So, but the schema still matters because it's the source of truth that tells us what the browser should be exposing. So, like I said, we start off with our directives. We have some generator that turns the schema into test expectations. So whenever we go to the Playwright, we say, when we're looking for said component, is this the right accessibility information that should be applied to this component? So we go to the browser, it computes or looks at the accessibility tree, and then the Playwright verifies the computed semantics based on the specs. Okay, so we still need the semantics at the GraphQL layer because that is where we declare the intent, and we generate tests from that and create the rules the UI should be held against. So in this example here, we have a list item for each movie row, and then the summary is the sentence that we've talked about before. So the reason that this matters is that the accessibility bugs usually show up when you are testing maybe manually for the accessibility tools, when you're stepping through and you're like, well, this doesn't really sound like how I'd want it to be announced to my user. So the generator has to translate the schema into intent and then into browser assertions. So in the demo, in the next few slides, we're going to see how we generate the files, and then when we were running the tests and seeing a failing test and a passing test, and then how it looks when you're walking through the screen itself. But for the demo, like I said, each movie row is a list item. So we're in the test, we're checking for a list item, but when you're making it more generic, you might not use list item. It just depends on your makeup of your screen. So tests assert the semantic meaning computed by the browser and not the raw implementation details. Okay, so now with the generation, we make a JSON file, which is the contract that sits between the schema and the test framework. So it goes from schema to this JSON file, and then we're going to be referencing the JSON file when we are testing it. So in the repo, that I'll share later on, the generator reads the directives and combines them with the sample data and emits a plain explanation object shown here. So we have the page that you're testing, the role that I expect, and the user-facing semantic output that I expect. So same example here with the movies, but we have the more information for the accessibility part. So we have the role that defines the structural meaning, the name, where is the primary label for the screen readers, and then the extra description depending on what extra information you are announcing. Okay, so the Playwright test is pretty simple, where we take the path, which is going to be the / movies of the demo within our files, but we get the path, we go to the expected role, and then we say, okay, does this component have the sentence or the accessibility information that I'm expecting to be here? So in the specific demo, like I said, the movie maps to a native list item, and after those contracts checks are run, there's also going to be the generic axe core that you can test to make sure that the other generic accessibility accessibility standards are met for your website. So here is just, like I said on the previous slide, this part checks your generic accessibility checks to focus on the more standard accessibility standards. Now, these tests can be less flaky because they're anchored on the semantics and not necessarily on the CSS selectors. So instead of writing your test to look for certain CSS classes or a certain DOM structure, we can see based on the roles, and then finding to make sure that the accessibility or whatever information is applied correctly. So, but less flaky does not mean it's impossible to break. If you choose unstable names or let roles change constantly, it can still create noisy tests and flaky tests, which as a developer is annoying when you're pushing up stuff to GitHub and everything. You have to keep rerunning your tests. So the point is that this architecture moves toward intentional semantics. Okay. Hopefully the Wi-Fi is on my side. Okay, so here I'm just going to be actually okay, so not sure why this is not running, but it will be showing sorry, I don't know if it's the Wi-Fi, but anyways, so in this video, it would be showing when I'm writing the generation command to generate the JSON that we're going to be checking, and then it generates the Playwright test. Okay, so yes, the proof that it did work at the top, but and this one's not running either. Okay, so Okay, so we wrote the generation command at the top, and then this was supposed to show a failing test. But since, I don't know, yeah, I think it's the Wi-Fi is not on my side today. But the failing test was supposed to show that when we are checking the expected sentence on this certain component, sometimes it can be very flaky when you first start out, because say if I'm expecting a period or a comma in a certain place, but then later on I'm just like, okay, well, this is not what I expected, so I have to go in and either fix my test or fix the construction of the template for the sentence. So that can be either or, depending on what you want in your output. Let's see. Okay, so this one was supposed to show that the test was fixed. So after I went in and made the changes to say that the expected should be matching the outcome, then it will pass. So the Playwright would show a worker that passed the test. Okay, let's see. It's not moving. Okay, so for the demo for this slide, would be the desired state of how you want the user to transverse through your site. So you have a movie row. So the top one will show like the inception, the rating, and the release year. So using VoiceOver on my Mac, I step through the screen and then to make sure that it's spoken as one component. So instead of like going into each individual data piece within this in this row, it makes it more efficient for someone to go through your screen and pick whatever movie they want based on whatever information you're giving them. So I'll also add that depending on the screener you use, it might add in like default information saying that this is a selectable text, or if it's a group, or depending on how you map it, it will say that you're in a group or in a list or when you come out of that said component. Since this one I assume is probably not going to play either, but the unwanted one is like, say if we are going through and we change, instead of having the list item, you change it to something else, then it will be more fragmented where it says the movie name first, then it goes into the like description or the summary after that, says the movie name again. So it's kind of can be confusing to the user depending on how much they can see the screen, but it's also inefficient where you're kind of transversing multiple pieces of the same row and getting the same information more than one time. Okay, so some of the pain points can show up like in your pull request where your tests fail. Sometimes when you can create a very simple custom test and be able to run like acts, keep the logs, and generate the outputs. So we can generate the test file, run Playwright, run the acts core, like the builder that we saw in a few slides ago. And then we can fail on drift or violations depending on what you are expecting or how you built your screen. And then any pitfalls to keep in mind is that the template wording or UI might drift. So similar to the video that I couldn't play, but I explained about how the text or sentences can be different. So that was one of the biggest gotchas where the wording and the semantics expectations were not the same. So that was a bug because we wanted it to be one way and it didn't turn out to be that way. And then we generated files were easy to mistake for a source of truth. So instead of having like a generic test file that you can edit, we made sure that we have a file that can generate the test and then leave in comments to say that if you edit this file, it will be overwritten when you rerun the generation command. Stable names need to share team agreement. Oh, sorry. Stable names need to be agreed upon for teams so everyone knows exactly what they're looking at. Now, how can this approach be incorporated into your workflow? I would not start on the whole app, and I would start on like a small set of high-value screens. So maybe if you are doing a checkout app, then you'd probably start off making your checkout screen more accessible. So identify key screens, prioritize workflow, user flow, and then focus on repeated elements. You want to focus on repeated rows and cards since those are the easiest to implement. So list items, card components, and repeated patterns. Establish some type of glossary where everyone can look back at. So define your token names, document patterns, and then have team alignment. And then when you're assigning ownership, like who is responsible for, approving such like the semantic information or like approving your PR. Now, if you only measure pass and fail, you miss whether like adoption's worth it, like if it's actually growing. So you can look at the number of annotated types or how many screens are actually using this flow. Generated specs in your CI, and then seeing how many drift failures are actually caught pre-merge. And then your flake rate over time. So my closing thoughts is that accessibility should be something we reconstruct from scratch should not be something reconstruct from scratch in every client. They should be declared once, and then you can generate test files to make sure that they or be applied at the right components. And then also like having that source of truth to say that, okay, well, this is what should be said here to make sure that the experience is the same across platforms. But it's also the question of who owns the directives. Is it going to be your PMs? Is it going to be the back-end developers? Who comes together to say that these directives should be how they are, where they should be applied, and then what extra information should it give? And then what happens if that metadata is missing? Do you have a fallback on your client side, or how would you handle that? And then if you also are keeping in mind localization, if you are doing multiple languages, where do you keep that? Do you keep that where you are already doing it, or do you shift it into this architecture? But that's a big idea. If you want to find me outside of this, that's my LinkedIn, the GitHub link. I'm going to push up new code later today, so it'll be more updated. But yeah, if you need any screen readers for Rub, you can use like VoiceOver for Mac, and there's also JAWS or NVDA. But yeah, if you need mobile screen readers, I can also tell you that. But yeah, thank you. It's fine, either way.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about the videos. I don't know why they weren't running.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for the talk. So in my company, we are not using GraphQL, we are using REST API, but we are also interested in improving accessibility for our applications. So can this approach somehow be adopted to REST APIs?
I think it can. I'm not sure where you'd put it. Like, say if you're using like gRPC, I know you can put in like the protobuf or the message, or like I think it's options, but I don't remember like if there's like a specific name that you can incorporate it into REST. But I'll get back to you on that. I think so.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Might be a stupid question. I don't do much of accessibility testing, but from my understanding, accessibility effectively is a markdown in the UI, right? In the page, in the script of the page. So why don't we just verify this XML, basically the XML tags that they are there on the dev side using some linters? What is the benefit of having it in Playwright? Thank you.
So you could, the linting actually is a good idea. The Playwright is supposed to be to check or make sure that you are applying it to the right components. Where you're getting the actual source of the information is going to be like within the schema, or like say if you have a plugin that makes the sentences. So I think the idea was more, instead of doing it in 3 different repos or 3 different code bases for different platforms, you can just do it once and then have it applied so it's more consistent, and then you can enforce that it's the same. I mean, you can also have like more communication between your teams. That would be good too. But I think this also takes out the possibility that, like for typos, or say if I construct it differently, I didn't look at some documentation or something like that where we don't align on how something should be written.
Okay.
I have one more question. Mm-hmm. So, as I understand, you generate JSON spec files and then use them in Playwright tests. So, do you commit these JSON files into the repo, or they are regenerated every time before I run my Playwright tests?
No, so you wouldn't commit the generated files, because you can run the files that generate those files. Sorry, I'll reword that. You don't commit the generated files, but you commit the files that do the generation. So you would, when you run like the script, it will generate the JSON or the Playwright test, and then that you can run itself.
So in the test command, it it generates spec files, and after then it runs Playwright.
It will run the, yes, so it would run the spec, it will create the spec file, and then the test will reference the spec file. Yeah.
And if I run my tests, for example, from VS Code extension, where I can just click to run the particular test. So is it possible to set up this? So I'm thinking about if my spec files get outdated for some reason, how can I be sure that I am testing over the most actual information that I have for my project?
That's a good question. Well, I think that when you run the test, right, and you see that's a failure, well, I guess you can always regenerate or run the regeneration command to make sure that those files are up to date.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Hi, we have been using Xcode with WCGA, AA or AAA 22 standards a lot in our end-to-end test cases. So there have been multiple areas we need to test with accessibilities. Either the name, either sometime we need to check the links are also available with the HTML tags. So how you're gonna manage with this API? Because the links are generated runtime and sometimes they are dynamic.
So for the links, so the link itself are you talking about the actual link itself or the accessibility information that's going to be applied on, like, if you click the link?
I'm talking about the information because the information is coming through the API from the schema, right? And links are generated at runtime at the client side. Sometimes the links are dynamic also. So how are we gonna get these links from the schema and integrate with all that stuff? Because at least at some point we need to make sure the link is working fine and the link is at least available for the people, right?
That's a good question.
It's not even about the link. There are a lot of other attributes we need to check with accessibility because we are not even talking about only the blind people. There are some other color blinds and other type of people. As you said, there are 16% people with the disability. So even in Xcode, WCGA to AA or even AAA standard do not cover all of these disabilities. They are they claim that they are covering like more than at least a maximum 30% of the disabilities at this point. So how are we gonna get all this information through the schema and get this from API? I hope you got my point.
Oh, what?
I hope you got my point.
Oh yeah, I got your point. Well, I think for this, the idea was that I was focusing on if it's hard to see on the screen. So there could be other approaches to say if you have a different disability, but this would be, that's what we were honing in on, like if you're missing the labels that are on the components that will be fed to the screen readers. So there was, yeah, so the focus was on that, but then that would have to be approached differently.
Okay, so the current focus is only about the labels and description and name, right?
Yeah, and for the sandbox, yes. For like whatever you're feeding your accessibility tools, then that information is what you're feeding to make sure that they're consistent.
And that's the static information.
Yep. Sorry, we are at time. Why don't you all do your next sessions so that you're not late for the session you would like to go to. Definitely find Vanessa for any follow-up conversations if you'd like.